Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a topic you probably never considered, yet it was absolutely vital for the most powerful men in the ancient world: the surprisingly strict nap schedules of Roman emperors. Imagine, if you will, the scorching Roman sun beating down on the Forum, the din of commerce and political intrigue echoing through the marble colonnades. You're there, sweating in your toga, maybe clutching a scroll or two, and all you can think about is finding a sliver of shade, a cool breeze, and perhaps, just perhaps, a moment of blissful oblivion. For you, a common Roman citizen, a quick doze might have been a stolen luxury, a brief escape from the relentless grind. But for the man who held the fate of millions in his hands, the emperor himself, a nap wasn't merely a luxury. It was a strategically planned, meticulously observed, and surprisingly strict affair. You probably won't survive this, not with the level of dedication these guys showed to their midday slumber. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You see, the concept of a midday break, a meridiatio as the Romans called it, wasn't some late imperial invention. It was baked into the very fabric of Roman life, long before emperors even graced the political stage. Think about it: a pre-industrial society, relying on natural light and human power, where the peak heat of the day often brought activity to a crawl. It just made sense to pause, to retreat, to recharge. But for the burgeoning Roman state, and later its emperors, this simple act of resting became intertwined with power, productivity, and even paranoia. Imagine yourself, not as a mere citizen, but as a newly appointed senator in the early republic. Your days are long, filled with debates, legal proceedings, and perhaps a bit of backroom dealing. You'd rise with the sun, conduct your morning duties, perhaps entertain clients during the salutatio, and then head to the Forum. By midday, the sun would be high, the air thick with dust and the scent of market stalls, and a creeping lethargy would start to set in. This wasn't laziness, it was a biological imperative. Your body, accustomed to the rhythms of the sun, was subtly telling you to slow down. So, a break was taken. Shops would close, streets would quiet, and people would retreat to their homes for a light meal and a much-needed respite. This habit, this ingrained cultural practice, set the stage for what would become the surprisingly rigid nap schedules of future emperors. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about efficiency. A well-rested senator was a more effective senator, theoretically. A refreshed merchant was a sharper negotiator. And for the early, evolving leadership of Rome, maintaining peak performance wasn't a suggestion. It was a necessity for survival in a highly competitive political landscape. Historians still argue whether the meridiatio was primarily a social custom, a health necessity, or a clever way to avoid the most brutal heat of the day while still maximizing daylight hours for work. Perhaps it was all three, a beautiful confluence of practicality and cultural habit. Now, fast forward a few centuries, and you're no longer just a senator, you're the emperor. The stakes are, shall we say, significantly higher. Your decisions impact millions, your word is law, and your energy levels directly correlate with the stability of the empire. Suddenly, that midday nap isn't just about feeling refreshed, it's about maintaining an image of unwavering authority, clear-headed judgment, and tireless dedication. But how do you reconcile the biological need for rest with the immense demands of governing an empire? That's where the strict part of these nap schedules comes in. Think of it like this. Your modern-day CEO might power through on caffeine and sheer willpower, but the Roman emperor didn't have a Starbucks on every corner, nor did he have the luxury of a private jet to whisk him away to a cooler climate for a power meeting. His office was his palace, a vast, bustling complex filled with petitioners, advisors, and potential assassins. The heat was real, the pressure immense, and the need for a strategic pause undeniable. One quirky tidbit about these early Roman sleep patterns: even the humblest Roman household would often have a designated space, a cubiculum, specifically for rest, not just at night but also for the midday doze. It wasn't always a luxurious bedchamber. Sometimes it was just a simple cot in a cooler, quieter part of the house. The idea was to create a sanctuary, however modest, where the mind and body could truly disengage. Imagine trying to explain that concept to your boss today. "Sorry, I'm just heading to my cubiculum for my mandated midday refresh." You'd probably get a blank stare, maybe an HR referral. This deep-seated tradition of the midday break meant that when the first emperors arrived on the scene, they weren't inventing a new practice. They were inheriting a deeply ingrained one. What they did, however, was formalize it, elevate it, and in some cases, weaponize it. The imperial nap wasn't just about comfort. It became a symbol of control, a testament to the emperor's ability to dictate even the natural rhythms of the day, bending them to his will and the needs of the state. You might imagine an emperor simply flopping onto a chaise lounge whenever the fancy struck him, perhaps with a bunch of grapes dangling overhead and a slave fanning him with a giant palm frond. And sure, there was probably some of that. But beneath the veneer of indulgence lay a surprisingly rigorous system, one that would evolve and adapt with each successive ruler. It wasn't always about comfort, sometimes it was about secrecy, sometimes about projecting an image of tireless work even when resting, and sometimes it was just about trying to get 5 minutes of peace in a very, very loud world. You can almost hear the sigh of relief as the heavy oak doors closed and the imperial chamber finally went quiet, even if only for an hour. It's like when you finally get to kick off your shoes after a long day, but with significantly higher stakes and probably a lot more guard. So, you've got this deeply ingrained Roman tradition of the midday nap, the meridiatio, a cultural habit as ubiquitous as sandals and olive oil. Now enter Augustus, the first emperor, the man who essentially invented the job description. He wasn't just some random guy who stumbled into power. He was a master of public relations, a shrewd politician who understood that every single aspect of his life, from his clothes to his dining habits, projected an image. And that, my friend, absolutely included his sleep schedule. You see, Augustus wasn't about ostentatious displays of power like some emperors who came after him. His brand was stability, tradition, and efficient governance. He wanted to be seen as a tireless worker, dedicated to the Republic, even as he dismantled it. But even Augustus, the man who claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, couldn't defy the biological clock or the Roman sun. So, his approach to the midday nap was a fascinating blend of necessity and calculated performance. Imagine you're one of Augustus's advisors, perhaps Agrippa, his trusted general and son-in-law. You're deep in a discussion about frontier defenses or grain shipments, and suddenly, the imperial eyelids begin to droop. Does the meeting just end? No, not with Augustus. He didn't just casually drift off. Accounts suggest his naps were planned, precise, almost military in their execution. He understood that uncontrolled drowsiness in public could be perceived as weakness or, worse, a sign of indolence. And indolence was definitely not part of the Augustan brand. He made sure his midday rest was not excessive, nor was it hidden away in some opulent, inaccessible chamber. Rather, it was often taken in practical, even modest, settings. Suetonius, that delightful Roman biographer who dished all the dirt, tells us that Augustus would sometimes nap right there in his official robes, maybe in his litter while traveling, or in a quiet corner of his study. This wasn't because he lacked a comfy bed. It was a subtle message. I'm so dedicated to the state I can even recharge on the go without missing a beat. It's the ancient equivalent of a CEO taking calls from the gym. Productivity porn, Roman style. This mainstream historical fact about Augustus is crucial. He established the precedent that even an emperor needed to rest, but that rest had to be disciplined and contribute to his image of a diligent leader. He essentially codified the power nap for imperial consumption. It wasn't about indulgence, it was about sustained output. Think of him as the original efficiency expert, but instead of time motion studies, he was optimizing his own internal battery. Now for a quirky tidbit. It's said that Augustus sometimes took his naps in public places, or at least places where he could be easily seen to be resting briefly before returning to work. This wasn't some kind of performance art like, "Behold, my imperial slumber," but more a demonstration of his grounded nature and lack of pretension. Imagine him dozing off in the portico of his house, just like any other Roman citizen seeking refuge from the heat. It helped solidify his image as first citizen, rather than an aloof monarch. Of course, he probably had a legionary guard just out of sight, because even a grounded emperor needs security from stray chariots or overly enthusiastic petitioners. Historians still argue whether Augustus's reported humility in his napping habits was genuine or purely a shrewd political calculation designed to appease republican sensibilities. Was he truly a simple man at heart, or was every aspect of his life, including his downtime, a carefully orchestrated piece of propaganda? It's a chicken or egg scenario for the ages, isn't it? But either way, it worked. His routine would typically involve waking at dawn, handling official business, perhaps a walk or some exercise, then a light midday meal, followed by this strategic nap. Then, it was back to work, often continuing late into the evening. This wasn't a schedule for the faint of heart, or for someone who struggled with afternoon slump. He didn't have the luxury of an alarm clock on his wrist. He relied on natural light, his internal rhythm, and likely, a well-trained staff to gently rouse him. Imagine being the poor soul whose job it was to wake the most powerful man in the world. Pardon me, divine one, but the empire still needs governing, and perhaps a snack? You'd probably do it with extreme caution and maybe a quick prayer to Minerva. The key takeaway from Augustus's napping habits is that he set a high bar for imperial conduct. He demonstrated that even supreme power didn't excuse one from the common human need for rest, but that rest had to be productive, controlled, and never, ever appear to be a sign of weakness or idleness. He understood that a well-rested emperor was a clear-thinking emperor, and in the nascent days of the empire, clarity of thought was paramount to survival. His naps weren't just about recharging, they were a deliberate component of his overall strategy to project an image of steady, unwavering leadership. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief from his inner circle when he emerged from his meridiatio, refreshed and ready to tackle the next crisis, whether it was a Germanic uprising or a particularly stubborn senator. He was, in essence, the original work hard, nap hard proponent. You've just witnessed Augustus, the master of political optics, using his naps as a carefully curated part of his imperial image. Now, brace yourself, because we're about to delve into the decidedly less transparent world of his successor, Tiberius. If Augustus was the public-facing CEO, meticulously managing his brand, Tiberius was the reclusive, often paranoid, executive who preferred to work in the shadows, and his nap habits were no exception. Imagine yourself as a courtier in the early years of Tiberius's reign. The air in the palace is thick with a different kind of tension now. Augustus projected stability. Tiberius projected an unsettling mix of competence and deep-seated suspicion. Where Augustus might have napped in a relatively accessible spot to show his common touch, Tiberius often retreated into what felt like a fortress of solitude. His naps became more than just rest, they became shrouded in secrecy, fueling rumors and anxieties among those around him. The mainstream historical fact here is that Tiberius became increasingly withdrawn and secretive throughout his reign, particularly after he moved permanently to the island of Capri. This wasn't just about his personal preference, it fundamentally altered the dynamics of imperial power. Decisions were made remotely, often after long periods of reflection or, one might surmise, after a deep, undisturbed midday slumber. You could almost feel the collective holding of breath in Rome as the hours ticked by, wondering what the emperor was doing, or more precisely, not doing, during his extended periods of seclusion. Consider the practical implications. If the emperor is taking a nap, and that nap is carefully guarded, who has access to him? Who can relay urgent messages? This created a power vacuum, or at least a bottleneck, that courtiers and ambitious senators were desperate to exploit. The simple act of the emperor sleeping became a chess piece in the dangerous game of Roman politics. Now for a quirky tidbit that adds to the intrigue. It's rumored that Tiberius, especially during his Capri years, would sometimes take his naps in grottos or hidden caves along the island's coastline, places difficult for anyone to access without his express permission. This wasn't just about finding a cool, quiet spot. It was about absolute isolation, a complete withdrawal from the prying eyes and incessant demands of the court. Imagine trying to deliver an urgent dispatch about a barbarian incursion only to be told, "His Majesty is currently engaged in his meridiatio in the Mermaid's Grotto. Please return in 3 to 5 business days." It really puts a damper on urgent imperial business, doesn't it? This extreme privacy amplified the sense of mystery and fear that surrounded him. Historians still argue whether Tiberius's increasing isolation and the secrecy surrounding his daily routines, including his naps, were primarily a consequence of his deteriorating mental state, a strategic move to consolidate power and avoid assassination attempts, or simply a deep-seated misanthropy. Was he genuinely unwell, genuinely paranoid, or just genuinely disliked people? Perhaps all three, simmering together like a slow-cooked Roman stew of imperial angst. You can almost feel the stifling atmosphere in his inner circle. Unlike Augustus, who might have been gently roused by a trusted aide, waking Tiberius must have been a terrifying prospect. Would he be annoyed? Suspicious? Would you accidentally incur his wrath for disturbing his precious, solitary rest? The stakes were incredibly high. His naps weren't just about personal rejuvenation, they were periods where the imperial gaze was withdrawn, and in its absence, whispers and plots could potentially fester. This shift in napping philosophy under Tiberius highlights a critical aspect of Roman imperial life. The nap, in the hands of a different emperor, could transform from a benign, productive break into an instrument of power and control. His midday rest was less about refreshing his mind for public duty and more about providing him with a necessary respite from the constant vigilance he felt was required to survive. He didn't just sleep, he retreated. And that retreat was a silent, powerful statement to everyone in Rome: "I am not accessible on your terms." It's like your boss putting on those giant noise-canceling headphones in the office, but instead of just wanting peace, he's also subtly letting you know you can't bother him unless you're prepared to risk your entire career. This secretive approach to his meridiatio contributed significantly to the climate of fear and uncertainty that marked much of his reign. The emperor was literally unreachable for portions of the day, and for a system built on constant access and petition, this was revolutionary and deeply unsettling. You couldn't just knock on the door. You might as well have tried to hail a chariot on the moon. The very act of taking a nap, a seemingly mundane human activity, became imbued with political significance, a quiet period when the fate of the empire, and many individuals within it, hung in the balance, waiting for the emperor to re-emerge from his shadowy slumber. All right, you've navigated the enigmatic, secretive naps of Tiberius. Now, hold on to your laurel wreaths, because we're about to plunge into the wildly unpredictable world of Caligula. If Tiberius's naps were shrouded in paranoid silence, Caligula's were often loud, indulgent, and frankly, a bit unhinged. He took the concept of imperial rest and turned it into a performance piece, often with disastrous consequences for anyone unfortunate enough to be in his orbit. Imagine you're a hapless courtier during Caligula's reign. The atmosphere isn't tense with quiet dread like under Tiberius, it's vibrant with chaotic uncertainty. You never quite knew what Caligula would do next, and his naps, or lack thereof, played a significant role in this unpredictable dance. He wasn't one for rigid schedules or disciplined routines. His idea of a power nap was less about efficiency and more about sheer, unadulterated pleasure or, often, a sudden whim. The mainstream historical fact about Caligula is his notorious impulsiveness and extravagance. This wasn't just limited to his infamous banquets or his declaration of war on Neptune, it permeated every aspect of his daily life, including his rest. He didn't adhere to the Augustan ideal of the emperor as a tireless public servant. Instead, he embodied the absolute monarch, whose desires, however erratic, were paramount. So, if Caligula felt like napping at dawn, he napped at dawn. If he felt like extending his midday slumber into the evening, well, you just waited. And waited. This made life for his staff and advisors a waking nightmare. You couldn't plan meetings with any certainty. Urgent matters of state might be delayed for hours, even days, depending on the emperor's capricious sleep cycles. It's like trying to run a multinational corporation where the CEO's working hours are determined by the alignment of the stars and the last thing he ate for breakfast. Productive, it was not. Now for a truly quirky tidbit. Caligula reportedly had a fascination with elaborate, often bizarre, dream interpretation. He wouldn't just nap. He would, upon waking, often demand that his personal dream diviners immediately analyze whatever convoluted visions had graced his slumber. Imagine being on call for that job. "Oh, divine Augustus, I dreamt I was a turnip wearing a toga." And you, the dream interpreter, would have to spin that into some grand prophecy about the future of the empire, or face his notorious wrath. It's like a corporate brainstorming session, but instead of analyzing market trends, you're trying to decipher whether a dream about flying donkeys means a tax hike or a new chariot race. Historians still argue whether Caligula's erratic behavior, including his unconventional sleep patterns and reliance on dream interpretation, was a manifestation of genuine madness, the result of a severe illness, or a deliberate, if shocking, performance to assert absolute power. Was he truly insane, or was he just really enjoying being untouchable? Perhaps a bit of both, a toxic cocktail of unchecked authority and psychological instability. You can almost feel the exasperation of his Praetorian Guard, standing by as the emperor indulged in extended, unpredictable slumbers, sometimes emerging with a new, equally unpredictable decree. There was no gentle wake-up call for Caligula. It was more likely a nervous clearing of the throat, followed by a rapid assessment of his mood. Disturb him at your peril, but not disturbing him could also mean the collapse of some vital imperial function. It was a lose-lose situation for almost everyone around him. His power naps, if you could even call them that, were often taken in the most luxurious settings imaginable, draped in silk, surrounded by rare perfumes, sometimes even with orchestras playing softly in the background. It was less about restorative rest and more about demonstrating his absolute command over his own time and the resources of the empire. He was the ultimate embodiment of my house, my rules, extended to my empire, my nap rules. This stark contrast to Augustus highlights how the imperial nap, a seemingly simple aspect of daily life, could be warped and reshaped by the personality of the emperor. For Caligula, it wasn't a tool for efficiency or a humble retreat, it was another stage for his flamboyant, often terrifying, exercise of supreme power. The empire might be burning, but if Caligula was napping, then the empire simply had to wait. And if he woke up wanting to declare his horse a consul, well, that was just Tuesday. You definitely wouldn't want to be the one to tell him he'd overslept. You've just survived the terrifying whims of Caligula's napping habits, where rest was less about rejuvenation and more about erratic displays of power. Now, prepare for a jarring but perhaps welcome shift to the reign of Claudius. If Caligula was a whirlwind, Claudius was, at first glance, a gentle, scholarly breeze, a bit clumsy, prone to fits of absent-mindedness, but remarkably pragmatic. and his approach to the imperial nap perfectly reflects this complex persona. Imagine yourself as an official during Claudius's reign. The air in the palace feels less charged with manic energy and more with the low hum of administrative activity. Claudius, despite his physical infirmities and initial perception as a weakling, proved to be a surprisingly effective, if unconventional, emperor. He was a scholar, fascinated by history and languages, and his mind was often bustling with thoughts and ideas. This meant his naps weren't about self-indulgence or asserting dominance. They were a necessary pragmatic pause for a man who often appeared physically frail but possessed an exceptionally active intellect. The mainstream historical fact about Claudius is that he was a prolific administrator, responsible for a significant expansion of the imperial bureaucracy and the legal system. He issued numerous edicts and was deeply involved in the day-to-day governance of the empire. This level of engagement required sustained mental energy. So, for Claudius, the midday meridiatio wasn't a luxury. It was a practical tool to maintain his intellectual vigor and to manage his often frail health. He needed that downtime to ensure he could keep up with the demands of his self-imposed, rigorous workload. You can almost picture him nodding off mid-sentence while dictating a new decree about water supply regulations, only to snap awake moments later, ready to pick up exactly where he left off. Now for a quirky tidbit. Claudius was famously known for his absent-mindedness and tendency to fall asleep at inappropriate moments. There are anecdotes of him dozing off during dinner parties, legal proceedings, and even, it is said, during a gladiator show. For his naps in the palace, he reportedly had a particular aversion to being disturbed. However, given his somewhat fumbling nature, there's a story, perhaps apocryphal, but certainly entertaining, that one of his freedmen, Narcissus or Pallas, once had to literally shout or even clap loudly to rouse him for an urgent matter. Imagine trying to explain to the emperor, after startling him awake, that Gaul was in revolt or that the grain supply was running low. It's like trying to wake your grumpy teenager for school, but with the added pressure of potentially incurring the wrath of the entire Roman Empire. Historians still argue whether Claudius's physical infirmities and perceived awkwardness were genuine or if he cleverly exaggerated them to appear harmless and survive the deadly intrigues of the Julio-Claudian court. Was his apparent drowsiness a sign of true weakness or a subtle, almost theatrical, way to gain a moment of peace and quiet from the relentless demands of his position? It's a fascinating question, a testament to his unlikely survival in a family notorious for backstabbing. His approach to the nap was essentially utilitarian. He knew he needed the rest to function effectively, so he took it. But unlike Tiberius's secretive retreats or Caligula's theatrical displays, Claudius's naps often seemed to happen wherever he was and whenever the need became overwhelming. It wasn't about projecting an image of power. It was about ensuring he had the mental clarity to sign those edicts, review those accounts, and make those critical decisions. His court learned to work around his rhythm, understanding that a briefly dozing emperor was infinitely preferable to an exhausted and ineffective one. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief from his staff when he did take a proper, undisturbed nap, knowing that he would emerge somewhat refreshed and ready to tackle the mountain of paperwork that awaited him. He valued intellect and diligence, and he applied that same rigorous logic to his own physiological need. His naps were a form of self-preservation, ensuring that the brilliant, albeit sometimes bumbling, mind of the emperor remained sharp enough to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial governance. In a way, he legitimized the idea that even an emperor, particularly one with such a heavy workload, absolutely needed his designated downtime. He made it okay to say, "I'm not being lazy, I'm just recharging my imperial brain." You've just left the pragmatic, sometimes sleepy, world of Claudius's administrative nap. Now, prepare yourself for a complete tonal shift as we pivot to his successor, Nero. If Claudius used his naps to fuel his bureaucratic diligence, Nero, in his characteristic fashion, transformed the midday slumber into an extension of his artistic ambitions, his decadent lifestyle, and his increasingly unpredictable temperament. Imagine you're a Roman citizen, perhaps an aspiring poet, living under Nero's reign. The air isn't charged with scholarly pursuits or administrative hum. It's buzzing with theatricality, artistic competition, and a lurking sense of instability. Nero wasn't content to merely govern. He wanted to perform, to create, to be adored for his talents, whether in music, poetry, or chariot racing. His daily routine, including his rest, was often bent to serve these artistic whims, making his nap schedule as flamboyant and unpredictable as the emperor himself. The mainstream historical fact about Nero is his notorious devotion to the arts and his penchant for extravagant public spectacles. He saw himself as a divinely inspired artist, and everything, from statecraft to his personal habits, eventually revolved around this self-perception. So, his naps weren't just about physical rest. They were sometimes part of his creative process, or perhaps a recovery period from particularly intense artistic endeavors or late-night revelries. You wouldn't be surprised to hear he might have dreamt up a new lyre composition during his midday doze. Consider the atmosphere in Nero's court during his meridiatio. It wouldn't be hushed reverence as with Tiberius, or pragmatic efficiency as with Claudius. Instead, you might imagine a scene of relaxed indulgence, perhaps with soft music playing, carefully chosen perfumes wafting through the air, and certainly no urgent petitions interrupting his creative flow. Interrupting Nero's nap could mean interrupting his next great ode, and that was a career-ending, perhaps even life-ending, mistake. Now for a quirky tidbit. Nero reportedly had a specially designed sleeping chamber or cubiculum that was incredibly elaborate, complete with mechanisms that could change the lighting, introduce different scents, and even simulate natural sounds like birdsong or flowing water. He had slaves whose sole purpose was to ensure his napping environment was absolutely perfect, a true sensory retreat designed to inspire or simply to coddle his divine artistic spirit. Imagine applying for that job. Required: extensive knowledge of ambient soundscapes, advanced aromatherapy skills, and the ability to distinguish a genuine snoring emperor from a faked one. It sounds exhausting, frankly. Historians still argue whether Nero's embrace of artistic expression and his increasingly extravagant lifestyle, including his sleep habits, was a genuine passion that simply overwhelmed his sense of imperial duty, or if it was a deliberate escapism from the crushing responsibilities of governance. Was he truly a misunderstood artist, or merely a self-obsessed tyrant with a penchant for elaborate slumber parties? It's a debate that pits the artistic soul against the demands of absolute power, and with Nero, the artist often won, consequences be damned. You can almost visualize Nero, emerging from a particularly deep midday nap, perhaps rubbing his eyes and suddenly declaring that all senators must now attend his poetry recitals, or that the imperial treasury should fund a new, incredibly expensive, aquatic ballet. His naps weren't just about restoring energy, they were part of the unpredictable, creative cycle of a man who viewed the Roman Empire as his personal stage. The very act of his rest became a dramatic pause in the ongoing theatrical production that was his reign. This blend of personal indulgence and imperial power meant that Nero's naps were a source of both frustration and anticipation for those around him. Frustration because urgent state matters could be put on hold indefinitely, and anticipation because you never knew what grand, often nonsensical, idea he might wake up with. He certainly didn't adhere to any strict schedule, preferring to nap when the mood struck him, or when he needed to recover from a particularly wild night of lyre playing and revelry. It was the ultimate artist's schedule, but applied to the leader of the known world. His lieutenants probably kept a running tally of how long he'd been out, not for operational efficiency, but to gauge the potential for explosive new decrees or dramatic performances upon his awakening. You've just witnessed Nero's artistic, chaotic approach to the imperial nap. Now, let's swing the pendulum dramatically back towards practicality with Vespasian. After the Julio-Claudian's flamboyant and often disastrous reigns, Rome needed a strong, steady hand, and Vespasian delivered precisely that. His approach to everything, including his naps, was rooted in common sense, efficiency, and a good dose of soldierly pragmatism. Imagine you're a Roman administrator during the reign of Vespasian. The air in the palace no longer hums with artistic indulgence or paranoid whispers. Instead, there's a palpable sense of purpose, a focus on rebuilding and fiscal responsibility. Vespasian was a no-nonsense general who rose through the ranks, and he brought that same disciplined, down-to-earth attitude to the imperial office. For him, a nap wasn't a performance, a secret retreat, or an artistic muse. It was a simple, necessary physiological break to ensure maximum productivity for the state. The mainstream historical fact about Vespasian is his focus on restoring Rome's finances and stability after the chaos of the Year of Four Emperors. He initiated massive building projects like the Colosseum and implemented new taxes to fund them. This required immense practical energy and clear-headed decision-making. Therefore, his midday meridiatio was strictly utilitarian, a quick recharge, often taken amidst his work, designed to keep him sharp for the relentless demands of governing a vast, recovering empire. He wasn't one to languish in bed when there were roads to build and treasuries to refill. Consider the scene during Vespasian's nap. You wouldn't find exotic musicians or dream interpreters. Instead, you'd likely find a quiet, functional room, perhaps even his study, where he could quickly lie down. His staff probably knew precisely how long he typically rested and when he expected to be roused. Disturbing him wouldn't be a life-threatening gamble, but it would definitely be frowned upon unless the matter was truly urgent, because interrupting his efficient recharge meant delaying state business. It's like when your dad finally sits down for 5 minutes after mowing the lawn. You know not to bother him unless the house is on fire or someone's about to lose a limb. Now for a quirky tidbit. Vespasian was known for his blunt wit and earthy sense of humor, even when it came to personal matters. It's entirely plausible that if someone accidentally disturbed his nap, he might have quipped something practical like, "Even an emperor's eyelids need their rest to see the imperial ledger clearly," or, "Don't bother me unless you've found a new source of tax revenue." He wasn't above a self-deprecating joke, even about his own need for sleep. This down-to-earth attitude was a refreshing change from his predecessors. Historians still argue whether Vespasian's overt pragmatism and lack of imperial pomp, including his very functional approach to rest, was a genuine reflection of his plebeian origins and military background, or if it was a shrewd political strategy to contrast himself sharply with the excesses of Nero and the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Was he truly just a simple soldier emperor, or was he playing a masterful role to win public trust? Either way, his straightforwardness resonated deeply with a Roman populace tired of imperial theatrics. You can almost feel the reassuring stability that emanated from Vespasian. His naps weren't periods of mystery or chaos. They were predictable, almost bureaucratic intervals of rest. He understood that a clear head was his most valuable asset, and he managed his sleep, just like he managed the empire's finances, with an eye towards maximum utility and minimal fuss. He wasn't trying to impress anyone with his sleeping arrangements. He was just trying to get enough rest to keep the wheels of empire turning smoothly. This practical approach to the imperial nap was a significant departure from the reigns before him. It marked a return to the Augustan ideal of the emperor as a diligent servant of the state, but stripped of Augustus's subtle propaganda. With Vespasian, what you saw was what you got: a man who worked hard, rested efficiently, and then got back to work. His naps symbolized the new era of Roman governance, grounded, sensible, and focused squarely on rebuilding for the future. You could practically set your sundial by his routine. You've just experienced the refreshing, no-nonsense pragmatism of Vespasian's nap. Now let's move to his son, Domitian. If Vespasian was the accessible, practical soldier, Domitian was a complex, often contradictory figure, a diligent administrator who became increasingly authoritarian and isolated. And his nap schedule, true to form, became another subtle, yet potent, tool in his calculated projection of absolute power and fear. Imagine yourself as a high-ranking official in Domitian's court. The initial sense of stability from Vespasian and Titus has given way to a palpable tension. Domitian, though an effective ruler, was also deeply suspicious, prone to paranoia, and obsessed with controlling every aspect of the imperial image. His palace was less a bustling hub of administration and more a meticulously controlled environment. Within this atmosphere, his naps were not just for rest. They were carefully managed periods that reinforced his aloofness and his omnipresent authority. The mainstream historical fact about Domitian is his increasingly autocratic rule and his efforts to establish a more divine, monarchical image, moving away from the first citizen facade favored by earlier emperors. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Master and God. This desire for absolute control extended to his personal time. His midday meridiatio was thus a period of deliberate inaccessibility, a time when the emperor was literally beyond reach, reinforcing his elevated status. You didn't just waltz in on Domitian, ever. Consider the atmosphere around Domitian's sleeping chambers. It would be a fortress of silence, guarded by eunuchs and trusted praetorians, far from the prying eyes and eager ears of courtiers. Unlike Augustus, who might make his brief rest visible, or Vespasian, whose naps were simply practical, Domitian's were almost ritualistic in their privacy. This wasn't just about personal comfort, it was about maintaining an aura of distance and mystery, making every interaction with him, including his reappearance after a nap, feel like an event. It's like your super strict boss who has a do not disturb policy on their office door that feels like it's enforced by laser grids and trained attack squirrels. Now for a quirky tidbit. Domitian was known to spend a considerable amount of time in solitary reflection, often walking alone or sitting in contemplation. It's been suggested that during these periods, which sometimes included his midday rest, he would engage in the rather peculiar habit of catching flies and impaling them with a sharp stylus. While perhaps apocryphal, this story underscores his isolation and perhaps a nascent cruelty. Imagine the imperial guard's daily report. Emperor's nap, undisturbed. Fly count, up by 3. It certainly paints a picture of a man who enjoyed his solitude, even if it involved some very tiny, unfortunate victims. Historians still argue whether Domitian's intense desire for privacy and his increasingly reclusive habits, including the careful management of his rest periods, were a symptom of genuine paranoia, a calculated strategy to protect himself from assassins, a very real threat for Roman emperors, or simply a personal preference for solitude. Was he genuinely afraid for his life, or did he just prefer the company of his own thoughts and, perhaps, the occasional fly? This debate touches upon the nature of absolute power and the psychological toll it took on those who wielded it. You can almost feel the anticipation when Domitian finally emerged from his strictly guarded slumber. Every movement, every word, would be scrutinized for signs of his mood. His naps weren't mere breaks. They were intervals of heightened political tension, where courtiers speculated and whispered, wondering what new decree or suspicion he might bring forth. He used his unavailability during these times to exert control, forcing everyone to wait on his pleasure, thus subtly emphasizing his ultimate authority. This calculated approach to the imperial nap further solidified the emperor's position as a being set apart, not just by title, but by access. Domitian understood that scarcity could increase value, and by making himself scarce, even for a few hours in the middle of the day, he elevated his own importance. His naps were not a sign of weakness, they were a quiet, powerful assertion of his absolute and unchallengeable reign. And woe betide anyone who mistook his period of rest for an opportunity to intrude. You've just navigated the tense, calculated privacy of Domitian's imperial naps. Now let's shift continents literally and join Trajan, the Optimus Princeps, as he takes his midday rest not in a luxurious palace, but often amidst the dust and din of a military campaign. If previous emperors' naps were about image, secrecy, or recovery from indulgence, Trajan's were about adaptability and unwavering dedication to imperial expansion. Imagine yourself as a centurion serving under Trajan. You're not in Rome. You're somewhere on the Dacian frontier, or perhaps in the deserts of Parthia. The days are long, filled with marching, siege engineering, and the constant threat of skirmishes. Your emperor is not some cloistered figure. He's right there with you, sharing the same hardships, and that includes his approach to rest. Trajan's ability to take effective naps, even in the most arduous conditions, speaks volumes about his character and his commitment to leading from the front. The mainstream historical fact about Trajan is his immense military success and the significant expansion of the Roman Empire to its greatest territorial extent. He was a general at heart, leading campaigns personally and sharing the rigors of military life with his soldiers. This meant his nap schedule couldn't be rigidly confined to a comfortable bedchamber in Rome. His meridiatio had to be flexible, snatched whenever and wherever circumstances allowed, a true testament to his practical and resilient nature. Consider Trajan's nap on campaign. He wouldn't have a luxurious cubiculum being hauled across the battlefield. Instead, he might take his rest in his tent, or even dismount his horse and lean against a tree, catching a quick 40 winks while his legions set up camp or prepared for battle. His staff would undoubtedly maintain a vigilant guard, not to create an aura of mystery, but to ensure the safety of the emperor in potentially hostile territory. It's like a modern-day field commander catching a catnap in a Humvee, not glamorous, but absolutely essential for sustained operational effectiveness. Now for a quirky tidbit. Trajan was known for his remarkable physical endurance and his simple tastes, even for an emperor. It's said he would often eat the same rations as his common soldiers and walk miles with his troops. This straightforwardness extended to his sleep. There's no record of elaborate rituals or special conditions required for his naps. He simply rested when his body demanded it, adapting to whatever environment he was in. He probably didn't even need a fancy pillow, just a saddlebag or a rolled-up cloak. Imagine him dismissing a worried aide trying to fan him. Nonsense, optio, a bit of honest dust never hurt anyone's slumber. Historians still argue whether Trajan's personal engagement in military campaigns and his willingness to share the hardships of his soldiers, including their rough sleeping conditions, was a genuine reflection of his character or a shrewd tactical move to inspire loyalty and cohesion within his vast armies. Was he truly one of the guys, or was he just very good at playing one of the guys to achieve his strategic objectives? This debate touches on the essence of leadership and the fine line between authenticity and calculated performance in a high-stakes environment. You can almost feel the quiet respect he commanded from his troop. Seeing their emperor, not in a distant palace, but resting beside them, ready to spring into action, would have been incredibly motivating. His naps were a symbol of his unwavering dedication, not just to the empire, but to the men serving it. He didn't demand special treatment for his rest. He simply integrated it into the relentless rhythm of conquest and governance. This adaptability in his nap schedule highlights a crucial aspect of Trajan's reign. He was a working emperor, constantly on the move, constantly engaged. His ability to recharge quickly, wherever he was, allowed him to maintain his energy and focus, ensuring the successful execution of his ambitious military and administrative goals. He proved that even at the pinnacle of power, efficient rest wasn't about luxury, but about fundamental readiness, even if that meant napping with a helmet for a pillow and the sounds of a distant skirmish as a lullaby. You've just left Trajan, the adaptable soldier emperor, catching naps on the dusty frontiers. Now we're transitioning to his successor, Hadrian, a vastly different kind of ruler. Hadrian was less about military expansion and more about consolidation, internal reform, and, famously, grand architectural projects. His approach to the imperial nap, much like his reign, was characterized by a blend of intellectual pursuit, meticulous planning, and a deep appreciation for culture and design. Imagine yourself as an architect or an engineer in Hadrian's court. The air isn't filled with the clang of swords or the shouts of centurions. It's permeated by the sounds of chisels, the hum of philosophical debate, and the rustle of blueprints. Hadrian was a polymath, an avid traveler, and a lover of all things Greek. His mind was constantly designing, theorizing, and planning magnificent structures, from his famous wall in Britannia to his sprawling villa at Tivoli. For such a visionary, the midday meridiatio wasn't just a physical break. It was often a period of mental conception, a quiet interlude where architectural visions might take shape. The mainstream historical fact about Hadrian is his passion for building and his extensive travels across the empire, personally inspecting and overseeing projects. He was an emperor who understood the power of monumental architecture to project imperial might and cultural sophistication. This meticulous engagement meant that even his rest periods might have been integrated into his creative and supervisory schedule, perhaps taken near a construction site or in a newly designed chamber he was personally overseeing. Consider Hadrian's nap. It wouldn't be a rough and ready affair like Trajan's. Instead, you'd likely find him in a thoughtfully designed space, perhaps a quiet alcove within his sprawling villa, or a shaded portico with a view of a carefully manicured garden. The environment would be conducive to contemplation as much as sleep, reflecting his intellectual inclinations. You wouldn't interrupt him unless you had a significant architectural emergency, like a column toppling over or an aqueduct springing a major leak. Even then, you'd probably present the problem in a perfectly drafted, aesthetically pleasing report. Now for a quirky tidbit. Hadrian was known for his love of walking and for personally surveying sites. It's said he would often take his midday rest after an extensive walk around a building project or a newly acquired piece of land for his villa, perhaps drawing sketches in his mind even as he drifted off. He reportedly had specific cubicula designed within his various villas, each with unique features, perhaps one with a view of a particular statue, another cooled by an innovative water system. He wasn't just napping. He was napping in style, integrating his rest into his personal architectural masterpiece. Imagine the design brief. Must be conducive to imperial slumber and sudden bursts of engineering inspiration. Historians still argue whether Hadrian's obsessive interest in architecture and his preference for philosophical discussions over military campaigns, including his more refined approach to rest, reflected a true intellectual bent or a strategic shift in imperial policy aimed at consolidating gains rather than endless expansion. Was he genuinely an enlightened monarch, or was his cultural patronage a sophisticated way to legitimize his reign and distract from potential internal strife? This debate explores the complex interplay between personal passion and political necessity in the life of an emperor. You can almost feel the quiet intensity that surrounded Hadrian during his meridiatio. He wasn't just resting his body. He was allowing his brilliant, restless mind to process complex ideas, to visualize grand designs, and perhaps to solve knotty engineering problems. His naps were less about switching off and more about a different kind of engagement, a mental download and recharge that would allow him to emerge with fresh perspectives and perhaps the blueprint for his next magnificent structure. It was the imperial equivalent of sketching ideas on a napkin during a lunch break, but with significantly more monumental result. His advisors probably learned to keep quiet during these periods, knowing that a disturbed Hadrian might just wake up and decide to redesign the entire Senate building. You've just left the meticulously designed, intellectually stimulating napping environments of Hadrian. Now, prepare to enter the profoundly disciplined and introspective world of Marcus Aurelius. If Hadrian's naps facilitated architectural genius, Marcus Aurelius's were deeply intertwined with his Stoic philosophy, serving as periods for self-reflection, contemplation, and the rigorous application of reason to the challenges of governing the vast Roman Empire. Imagine yourself as a philosopher or a military commander serving under Marcus Aurelius. The air in the imperial court doesn't hum with grand designs or the echoes of conquest. It resonates with a quiet gravitas, a sense of duty, and the ever-present weight of responsibility. Marcus Aurelius was not just an emperor. He was a dedicated Stoic philosopher, constantly striving for self-mastery and inner tranquility amidst external turmoil. For such a man, the midday meridiatio was less about simple rest and more about a deliberate spiritual and intellectual practice, a moment to recenter himself. The mainstream historical fact about Marcus Aurelius is his authorship of the Meditations, a series of personal reflections and philosophical exercises that served as a guide for his own conduct. He ruled during a particularly challenging period, marked by plague, wars on the frontiers, and internal rebellions. This constant pressure meant that his mental fortitude was paramount. Therefore, his naps were not periods of indulgence, but crucial intervals for mental and emotional recalibration, allowing him to maintain his composure and make rational decisions under immense stress. You can almost picture him waking from a brief slumber, picking up his stylus, and jotting down another profound thought on the transient nature of power or the importance of virtue. Consider Marcus Aurelius's nap. It wouldn't be in a lavish chamber designed for pleasure, nor on a battlefield amidst the clamor of war. Instead, you'd likely find him in a simple, unadorned room, perhaps with only a wax tablet and stylus nearby. His rest would be brief, functional, and purposeful, aimed at clearing his mind rather than indulging his senses. His staff would respect this time with a profound silence, knowing that the emperor was engaged in a form of mental wrestling, preparing himself for the next wave of imperial demands. It's like a seasoned meditator finding a quiet corner to reset before facing a particularly challenging client meeting. Now for a quirky tidbit. While not specifically about his naps, Marcus Aurelius was known for his remarkably frugal lifestyle, even as emperor. He ate simple food, wore plain clothes, and avoided unnecessary luxuries. It's entirely consistent with his character that his naps would also be devoid of any pomp or excess. He likely found comfort not in plush surroundings, but in the quiet discipline of his own mind. Imagine a luxurious pillow being offered to him, only for him to politely decline, preferring to rest his head on a rolled-up copy of Epictetus's Discourses. Luxury, he might muse, is a distraction from true wisdom. Historians still argue whether Marcus Aurelius's unwavering commitment to Stoic principles, including his disciplined approach to personal habits like sleep, was a genuine embodiment of philosophical ideals or a necessary coping mechanism for the overwhelming burdens of his reign. Was he truly a philosopher king, living by his creed, or was his philosophy a shield he donned to withstand the relentless assaults on his peace of mind? This debate delves into the very nature of leadership under duress and the personal sacrifices demanded by supreme power. You can almost feel the quiet strength that emanated from Marcus Aurelius even in his moments of rest. His naps were not escapes from reality, but deliberate engagements with his inner self, allowing him to process the day's events, anticipate future challenges, and recommit himself to the path of virtue. He emerged from these brief intervals not just physically refreshed, but mentally fortified, ready to face plagues, barbarians, and bureaucratic headaches with the unwavering calm of a true Stoic. He truly embodied the idea that rest was not a cessation of effort, but a different kind of effort, a profound turning inward to find the strength for outward action. You've just left the austere, philosophical napping world of Marcus Aurelius. Now, prepare yourself for a stark and often alarming contrast, as we plunge into the reign of his son, Commodus. If Marcus Aurelius embodied Stoic discipline, Commodus reveled in self-indulgence, gladiatorial fantasies, and a chaotic disregard for imperial decorum. His approach to the midday nap, predictably, mirrored this descent into excess and instability. Imagine yourself as a bewildered courtier during Commodus's reign. The palace no longer hums with philosophical contemplation or disciplined administration. Instead, it frequently echoes with the roars of wild beasts, the clash of weapons from mock gladiatorial contests, and the sounds of lavish, often drunken, banquets. Commodus, unlike his father, had little interest in governance. His passions lay in spectacles, self-aggrandizement, and living a life of unbridled pleasure. For such an emperor, the midday meridiatio was less about a disciplined recharge and more about recovering from the previous night's excesses or preparing for the next round of decadent amusements. The mainstream historical fact about Commodus is his notorious obsession with gladiatorial combat, his identification with Hercules, and his abandonment of administrative duties. He essentially treated the Roman Empire as his personal playground, and his personal habits, including his sleep, reflected this profound lack of responsibility. His naps weren't scheduled for productivity, they were taken when exhaustion from revelry demanded it, often at irregular hours, throwing the palace routine into disarray. Consider Commodus's nap. It would be in the most opulent, perhaps even gaudy, settings. Think chambers adorned with exotic animals, perhaps even a tame lion, drapes woven with gold thread, and servants fanning him with ostrich plumes. There would be no sense of urgency or purpose to his rest. It was simply another form of luxurious self-gratification. Waking him would be a precarious task, as his mood swings were legendary. You wouldn't just rouse him. You'd probably approach with extreme caution, perhaps bearing a gift, or at least a very good reason, and definitely a quick prayer to every deity you could think of. It's like trying to wake a hungover rock star who also happens to own the entire city and might decide to execute you for disturbing his beauty sleep. Now for a quirky tidbit. Commodus reportedly had a habit of napping in his gladiatorial costume, sometimes even on the floor of the arena's private chambers, after a particularly strenuous, or pretend, combat session. This wasn't for comfort. It was part of his immersive, fantastical role-playing as the ultimate gladiator. Imagine the surprise of a servant bringing him a refreshing drink, only to find the emperor sprawled out, still in his lion's skin and wielding a miniature club, dreaming of imaginary victories. Just 5 more minutes, I was about to pin the Amazon. Historians still argue whether Commodus's erratic and self-destructive behavior, including his excessive indulgence in personal pleasures and disregard for traditional imperial schedules, was the result of a spoiled upbringing, an inherited mental instability, or a deliberate rejection of his father's austere legacy. Was he genuinely mad, or simply a petulant child with too much power who saw no need to conform to expectations? This debate highlights the dangers of unchecked power and the potential for a single individual's personality to destabilize an entire empire. You can almost feel the exasperation and quiet despair among the more responsible members of Commodus's court. His naps were not periods of productive rest, but often unpredictable black holes in the daily schedule, during which urgent state matters piled up while the emperor dreamt of wrestling bears or triumphing in the arena. There was no sense of a ruler recharging for duty. It was simply a powerful man escaping reality, indulging every whim, and ensuring his own comfort above all else. His advisors learned to conduct business in the fleeting moments he was awake and lucid, knowing that another prolonged, self-indulgent slumber could begin at any moment. The imperial alarm clock for Commodus wasn't the sun, but rather the faint stirrings of his next debauched desire. You've just endured the chaotic, self-indulgent napping habits of Commodus, a stark reminder of how personal failings could impact the very fabric of the Roman state. Now, as the empire enters a period of intense instability known as the Severan dynasty, we see a fascinating blend of old traditions and new realities shaping imperial nap schedules. The emperors of this dynasty, though diverse in personality, all grappled with the increasingly precarious state of Rome, and their approach to rest often reflected this constant pressure. Imagine yourself as a general or a high-ranking civil servant during the Severan period. The palace atmosphere is charged not with philosophical debate or gladiatorial fantasies, but with military urgency and a pervasive sense of threat. The frontiers are constantly active, civil wars are a recurring nightmare, and the imperial throne is less a seat of divine power and more a hot seat prone to violent overthrow. For emperors like Septimius Severus, Caracalla, and Severus Alexander, the nap wasn't just a personal habit. It was a delicate balancing act between maintaining health for leadership and responding to the relentless demands of a crisis-ridden empire. The mainstream historical fact about the Severan dynasty is its focus on military might and the increasingly militarized nature of the Roman state. Emperors often spent significant time on campaign, leading their legions and dealing directly with external threat. This meant their nap schedules, much like Trajan's, had to be adaptable, but with an added layer of constant vigilance born from a less stable internal situation. A nap could be crucial for clear thinking, but too long a nap, or one taken without proper security, could be fatal. Consider the Severan emperor's nap. It might start in a campaign tent, then transition to a briefly secured villa, and then back to a hastily prepared chamber in Rome. There was less room for the eccentricities of earlier emperors. Rest was a tool for survival and effective governance, often snatched when possible, but always with an ear to the ground for the next crisis. You wouldn't interrupt a Severan emperor's nap lightly, not just for fear of their temper, but because you knew they were often resting in preparation for, or recovery from, intense military or political maneuvers. It's like a modern-day head of state trying to get some sleep in a war room, constantly aware that the next crisis call could come at any moment. Now for a quirky tidbit. Septimius Severus, the founder of the dynasty, was known for his incredible work ethic and his belief in rigorous discipline, even on campaign. It's said that he would often dictate letters and edicts even while lying down for a brief rest, his mind constantly turning over matters of state. His naps weren't passive, they were extensions of his relentless drive. Imagine the stenographer trying to keep up, taking notes while the emperor's eyes were closed, perhaps muttering strategic commands in his sleep. And furthermore, ensure the grain supply for Legio XXX is diverted to the Rhineland. Historians still argue whether the Severan emperor's militaristic focus and their sometimes brutal efficiency, including their pragmatic but often strained approach to rest, were necessary adaptations to the empire's escalating challenges, or if they ultimately contributed to its long-term decline by centralizing too much power in the military. Did they save the empire in the short term, or just delay the inevitable by exhausting its resources and its rulers? This debate underscores the constant tension between immediate survival and long-term stability in a crumbling empire. You can almost feel the exhaustion that permeated the Severan court. Naps were a brief, often insufficient, reprieve from the relentless pressure. For Caracalla, famous for his impulsive cruelty, his naps might have been unpredictable, interrupted by sudden outbursts or paranoid suspicions. For Severus Alexander, a more earnest but less forceful ruler, they were probably a welcome escape from the overwhelming burdens of his youth and the manipulation of his powerful mother, Julia Mamaea. This period shows how the imperial nap, once a sign of stability or indulgence, became a fragile necessity. Emperors often pushed themselves to the brink, making their midday rest less about leisurely custom and more about sheer endurance. It was a constant battle against fatigue, a desperate attempt to maintain clarity and control in a world that was spiraling into deeper turmoil. The very act of sleeping became a vulnerable moment, always shadowed by the threat of assassination or rebellion. You've just witnessed the Severan emperor's attempts to maintain their nap schedules amidst the growing militarization and instability of the Roman Empire. Now, as we move further into the 3rd century crisis and beyond, you'll observe a profound shift: the late empire's nap decline. The rigid, or even indulgent, midday routines of earlier emperors gradually erode, giving way to an era where constant threat and fractured authority made a settled, predictable nap almost an impossible luxury. Imagine yourself as a weary provincial governor, constantly facing barbarian incursions, economic collapse, and the bewildering rapidity with which emperors rose and fell. The idea of a structured, midday break, once a cornerstone of Roman life, begins to feel like a distant, quaint memory. For the emperors of this turbulent era, the barracks emperors and those who followed, the priority was survival, and that often meant sacrificing personal comfort, including reliable sleep. The mainstream historical fact here is the severe political and economic instability of the 3rd century crisis, characterized by frequent changes in emperor, civil wars, rampant inflation, and constant external threat. Emperors were often military strongmen, chosen by their legions, and their reigns were typically short and violent. This meant they were constantly on the move, leading armies, or defending their position, making any consistent nap schedule an almost laughable impossibility. The very concept of a relaxed meridiatio gave way to hurried, often anxious, catnap. Consider the nap of a late Roman emperor. It might be snatched in a hastily fortified camp, perhaps leaning against a shield wall, or in a cold, unfamiliar palace chamber after a long march. There was no time for elaborate preparations, no thought given to luxurious surroundings. The ever-present threat of assassination or rebellion meant constant vigilance. Disturbing such an emperor wasn't just a risk. It was a near certainty, as urgent news of a battle, a betrayal, or a new usurper could arrive at any moment. It's like trying to get some sleep while perpetually on call for a global emergency, with your phone vibrating every 10 minutes with another crisis alert. Now for a quirky tidbit. Due to the constant need for vigilance and rapid response, some emperors of this period reportedly resorted to sleep-in shifts within their inner circle, with trusted guards or advisors staying awake to ensure their security and to be able to rouse them instantly if danger arose. Imagine a rotation of loyalists, quietly watching their exhausted emperor, knowing that their own lives depended on his survival and their ability to wake him at the precise moment of peril. It's a far cry from Augustus's calm, dignified repose, isn't it? Historians still argue whether the decline of consistent imperial routines, including structured naps, during the late Empire was a symptom of the Roman state's overall decline, or a necessary adaptation that ultimately allowed the empire to persist for centuries longer than might have been expected. Did this relentless pace contribute to imperial burnout and inefficiency, or was it the only way to manage a fractured, besieged realm? This debate touches on the resilience of human endurance in the face of overwhelming adversity and the sheer grinding effort required to maintain even a semblance of order. You can almost feel the bone-deep weariness of these emperors. Their naps were no longer deliberate acts of power or philosophical reflection, they were desperate attempts to stave off exhaustion in a world that offered no respite. The very idea of a strict nap schedule became an oxymoron, replaced by whatever meager moments of unconsciousness could be grabbed between battles, negotiations, and political purges. The peaceful quiet of a midday slumber had vanished, replaced by the clang of armor, the shouts of the watch, and the ever-present threat of the unexpected. The emperors of this era were living on borrowed time, and often on borrowed sleep. You've just witnessed the slow, agonizing decline of the imperial nap during Rome's turbulent late empire, where peace and predictable rest became elusive luxuries. Now, let's bring our journey full circle, considering the echoes of imperial naps and how these ancient Roman habits, surprisingly strict or wildly indulgent, continued to resonate through history and even touch our modern world. Imagine, if you will, the faint whisper of a Roman centurion's distant snore carried on the winds of time, or the lingering scent of exotic perfumes from Nero's chambers. The routines, the philosophies, and even the eccentricities surrounding the Roman emperor's midday slumbers didn't just vanish into the sands of antiquity. They laid subtle groundwork, both culturally and biologically, for how later societies and their leaders approached the crucial act of resting in the middle of a bustling day. The mainstream historical fact here is the enduring legacy of Roman customs, language, and law across Europe and beyond. While the empire itself eventually fell, many of its daily practices, including the concept of a midday break, persisted. The meridiatio, the midday rest, didn't disappear with the last emperor, it simply evolved. You see its direct descendants in the siesta of Mediterranean cultures, the mittagsschlaf in Germanic countries, or even the relatively recent concept of the power nap in our own fast-paced world. The Romans, in their own way, perfected the art of the midday reset, and that wisdom was too valuable to simply discard. Consider how those ancient habits, whether the disciplined efficiency of an Augustus or the pragmatic resilience of a Trajan, subtly informed leadership across millennia. A general who learned to snatch sleep on the battlefield, or a statesman who valued a clear head after a brief rest, were unknowingly tapping into principles refined by their Roman predecessors. The idea that a period of quiet reflection or physical rest could enhance performance wasn't just a Roman novelty. It was a universal truth they keenly understood. Now for a quirky tidbit. Even today, in some older European administrative buildings or universities that trace their lineage back to Roman or medieval foundations, you might still find small, almost forgotten retreat rooms or quiet chambers that were historically used for short, sanctioned periods of rest during the day. They're often unmarked, perhaps just an unusually quiet room off a bustling corridor, a subtle architectural echo of the ancient cubiculum and the enduring need for a momentary escape from the demands of work. You could almost hear the faint rustle of a toga or the soft murmur of an ancient dream. Historians still argue whether the persistence of midday rest traditions in many cultures is primarily a direct inheritance from Roman practice, a universal human response to the biological need for a midday dip in energy, or a combination of both, where cultural habit reinforced biological imperative. Did the Romans simply codify something innate, or did they actively shape how we perceive and practice midday rest? It's a fascinating chicken and egg question that reminds us how deeply entwined our habits are with the long, winding path of human history. You can almost feel the continuity, the thread stretching from Augustus's calculated power naps to your own occasional midday slump. The challenges of leadership, the demands of a complex society, the simple fact of human physiology, these haven't changed. What did change were the specific rituals, the imperial stakes, and the cultural justifications for that brief, yet powerful, pause in the middle of the day. From the grand, secretive slumbers of Tiberius to the desperate catnaps of the barracks emperors, each ruler's approach to rest paints a vivid picture of their personality, their priorities, and the particular era they inhabited. So, the next time you find yourself stifling a yawn in the afternoon, remember the Roman emperors. They understood the power of a good nap, and in their surprisingly strict, or spectacularly chaotic, schedules, they left us a legacy far more complex than